right, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kok Joo, who will be speaking at our breakfast session today. So we have Dr. Chan. So Dr. Chan is a very passionate pediatrician, and he's our newly conferred neonatologist over at our neonatal intensive care unit, and he's a very keen and passionate researcher as well. And he is keen to develop advanced skills in neonatology. And so therefore, when he was in Australia, he had the chance to actually be involved in a very important research. And so without further ado, I will let him talk to us about machine learning, and his title will be on machine learning phenotyping of NICU admissions, assessments of long-term mortality, neurodevelopment, and educational outcomes using linked population data sets. This is a very important key research that will try to look at one of the biggest registry actually in many areas. It's a very important registry in Australia. So Dr. Kok Joo, you may start.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Prof, and for the very kind opportunity to share my ongoing research work. So we know that infants being admitted to neonatal intensive care units are at increased risk of adverse outcomes even after discharge. But we also know that long-term outcomes are notoriously difficult to assess. Most literature are designed around specific characteristics, looking at specific outcomes, whether we're talking about term babies or preterm cohort. However, our clinical reality, as you can see from these 4 cases, these are real cases that we're looking at the lens of a baby who's about to be discharged from NICU. You can see that there's so much variation between gestation, birth weight, prenatal, intrapartum, postnatal, as well as socioeconomic factors. So it leads to the question, is there a better way to reconcile our research directions to fit in of this clinical reality of multiple factors in a single baby? Before I go in further, a few key definitions I want to share. Number 1 is phenotyping, which means recognizing specific patterns based on similarity and dissimilarity. And it involves a combination of clinical interpretation and known evidence to guide the pattern identification. We do it in a clinical basis. For instance, if I'm called about a lady who has rupture of membranes, maternal pyrexia, as well as foul-smelling liquor, my brain fits in the picture and thinks of a pattern known as the baby might be at risk of early onset neonatal sepsis. And how do I come to that phenotype is because I have the experience as well as my knowledge about this matter. However, our human mind can only process that much amount of characteristics, and we are much better at binary variables. For instance, if you tell me rupture of membranes more than 18 hours, it's a tick box in my brain and say, yes, there's a risk factor for sepsis. But it gets more convoluted if you introduce multiple variables and it's continuous in nature. Is this the same for a 17 hours rupture of membrane for a 3 kilo baby? Is it the same for a 16 hours rupture of membrane for a 2.8 kilos baby? So as you introduce more and more characteristic, the pattern becomes somewhat more difficult for us clinicians to be a bit more to ascertain. Hence comes in a new technique in the form of unsupervised machine learning approach as part of the growth of AI and machine learning studies in the world of medical research. Clustering is essentially a computer-driven technique to group patients together based on similarity or dissimilarity of multiple multidimensional characteristics, and they can do it many folds greater than what we can as a human brain. The main aim is to identify natural groupings in data, and the machine is able to do it without inherent biasness. For instance, we are clinicians, we are swayed by whatever knowledge and experience we have. The machine is not. Whatever characteristics you put in, it will process it as just data points, and it can do it even without outcome anticipation. So there are very tiny baby steps in this field in neonatology. We can see that there's some efforts to do it in preterm babies, like this cohort of around 5.8K babies, looking at preterm baby where they did 2-step clustering, and they were able to identify, the machine was able to identify 12 separate patterns. In a smaller cohort looking at extremely low birth weights of less than 1 kilo for 250 patients, the authors were able to identify 6 distinct patterns of ELBWs based on 62 characteristics. Another interesting way to use unsupervised machine learning approach is, as you can see, this is from Dr. Joseph New's team in the US. He's a leading researcher in an entity known as necrotizing enterocolitis. When it comes towards acquired neonatal intestinal disease, it's one of those very vague conditions that we tend to stick the diagnosis of NEC on top of it whenever we encounter any babies like that. He is challenging the paradigm by using unsupervised machine learning with the hopes of delineating different clusters, which he got 5 clusters out of 50 characteristics, with the hopes of understanding the entity better. Now, before I go on further, this approach of unsupervised machine learning with clustering, it is a phenotyping exercise. And the reason I mention this is because this is different from probably the more popular techniques that's being published more aggressively, which is supervised machine learning, whereby those techniques are designed for prediction, modeling, and prognostication. So I just wanted to highlight that this is a different technique that we're looking at altogether. However, looking at the past 3 papers, I think we still feel that there's a few key knowledge gaps missing. What about the term babies? Instead of excluding them, is it then possible to do this in a large volume, multidimensional data for all NICU admissions? And secondly, how does this clusters and phenotypes actually relate to outcome? So for all 3 of the previous paper, death was included in part of the clustering process, death in NICU, but that's about it. It then leads to the question that we have, are these machine learning derived phenotypes actually clinical meaningful? Do they actually have proper different outcomes if we were to take them out and analyze them separately? This leads to our objective, whereby we use linked population dataset in NICU admissions to develop a large volume data-driven clustering model. We then aim to phenotype each cluster and associate each phenotype to long-term outcomes. And our aim was to identify groups with differing outcomes. This is essentially our roadmap of our research project. We're going to begin first by talking about maternal infant characteristics that we have extracted, and this is from the linked population dataset that's coming from the New South Wales state in Australia, which is the most popular state, and it comprises of 10 major NICUs. So the important thing about this slide is essentially what happens is that every single patient that's born in New South Wales will get a definite identifier that's unique to them, and it will be followed up not just in the hospital setting, but as well as our government registry. And all of this is run by the Centre of Health Record Linkage. For the purpose of our research work, our main data set is we like to fondly call it NICUS, which is our Neonatal Intensive and Special Care Unit Registry. Every baby in New South Wales that's admitted to a NICU will be registered here. It is further enriched with maternal mental health, birth, and hospitalization dataset, with probabilistic linkage linking all these 4 together and then connected to government agency registries. For instance, the Registry of Death, Education, and Cerebral Palsy Alliance. It allows us the chance to actually observe how this baby grew and how they turn up to even 18 years of life, where we can look at death, education, and neurodevelopment. In total, we look at an epoch of 2007 to 2016 to maximize availability of all data from all datasets. In total, we are looking at 29,000 worth of patients' data, and we've curated a grand total of 89 characteristics. The list is lengthy, as you can see, but the 2 key points I wanted to show here is, 1, all of these characteristics comprises of multi-dimensions, meaning to say there's continuous, binary, ordinary, and categorical variables altogether. And secondly, all of these variables, we're looking at it from a static time point, meaning to say we are looking at it when the baby is about to be discharged from NICU because the data is recorded until then, or if the baby dies in NICU. The next step is we're going to start applying unsupervised machine learning, and the technique we chose was K-prototype. Just a very brief note on this due to time limitation. Essentially, K-prototype is an extension of K-means clustering. So the previous models of clustering approaches usually views things in a 2-dimensional plane. For instance, X and Y axis, as you would imagine on a graph. And K-means clustering was designed to do that using continuous variables. There's also techniques that do dimension reduction analysis, trying to convert continuous variable, for instance, multiple dimensions into two planes as well. However, K-prototype is an advancement on K-means clustering. In a nutshell, the mathematical model allows all the dimensions to be preserved as it is. And we think that it's an advancing technique in terms of maintaining data integrity when it comes towards interpreting it. Now, we're going to, using the K prototype to generate the cluster, the next important step is to then understand what each of these clusters mean. Now, in total, we were able to generate 6 clusters using the K prototype. This is a TSNE. Essentially, it's a visualization technique to help us comprehend things after what the K prototype has done, to visualize it in a 2-dimensional plane. I wanted to highlight here that every single dot in this picture represents a single patient, okay? And how this diagram is generated is with the introduction of every single patient from patient 1 to the last patient. Every single patient that's introduced readjusts the graph because they need to calculate the distance based on similarity and dissimilarity. And therefore, this diagram is the product of millions of iterations by the program in order to generate. As we can see here, there's 6 distinct clusters. There's these blue clusters and orange clusters down here. There's a bit of intermixing, which I will mention later on. You have this very distinct maroon-colored island down here of patients, which indicates these are very, very special group of patients. They're very different from the rest. And then as you see, there seems to be a gradient between green, red, and purple. So what does all this mean? We follow up with the understanding with using a random forest technique. This is a decision trees technique based in which what happens is that every single patient using 89 characteristic, the system goes through a yes/no binary system until the system figures out why that patient ends up in that cluster. The mathematics that's used behind it, that can be derived from it, is 2 things. This is known as Gini index and the SHAP values. I wanted to highlight here that we do multiple techniques in these instances as a form of cross-checking each other. Because up until this state on unsupervised machine learning, there's no clear validation techniques. Essentially, what Gini index provide its relative importance. And if we were to use cluster 1 as an example, so what we do is that we all clusters, all 6 clusters, all of them will have a ranking of 89 characteristics. We are just looking at the top 10 characteristics for all clusters because they contribute the most in terms of the cluster generation. So if we're looking at a Gini, a birth weight with a relative importance of 16%, what it means is that birth weight contributed 16% of the weightage to the clustering process. For the SHAP score, as you can see from the MAV value, birth weight is 0.11. Length of stay in NICU is about 0.05. What SHAP score means that it is that birth weight contributes twice the amount of length of stay in NICU. But the purpose of comparing them side by side is to see that overall, if you look at the top 10, there's hardly any differences to show that the technique is actually so far has been quite robust. So this slide shows if we take all the top 10 characteristics from all the clusters and we remove the duplicates, we get this list of 25 to 26 most important characteristics that's used by the machine in order to distinguish the patients. The important thing I wanted to share this is, number 1, this is not arranged by the order of importance. There's no technique that's able to calculate which characteristic contribute to the overall picture of clustering because every cluster is separate with its own ranking. However, we can infer that certain characteristics appear more oftenly in the top 10 list. And this is something very important because we must remember that the machine doesn't have any clinical bias at them. Every single thing we put in here to them is just numbers. So we are very thankful that birth weight is important for all 6 clusters. And gestation is important for at least 5 out of 6 clusters. Because if neither of them are important, then pretty much we have shot ourselves in the foot. So putting this all together, you can see very minimal differences between the Gini and SHAP, just 3 variables which are different from them, but that's way below way below any threshold of concerns from our side. Before I go on further for the juicy part of explaining what we think the phenotypes we have derived are, we just wanted to share a bit of preterm classification. So extreme preterms are babies born less than 28 weeks. Very preterm is up to 31 weeks plus 6 days. And moderate preterm is up to 33 weeks plus 6 days. And the late preterm is up to 36 weeks plus 6 days. And essentially based on the information we have, we were able to phenotype them into these 6 clusters. Cluster 1 is our most populous cluster. It's comprises of more than 1/3 of the patient. Now we call them the late preterm to term group with low morbidity, and therefore they work as our comparator group. Cluster 2 is also a late preterm to term group, but with poorer outcomes. Cluster 3, our maroon island all by itself, is the group of term babies with moderate severe HIE. And I wanted to mention that the machine was able to detect it by itself, even with our earlier prototypes. This cluster always comes out. As we move on to the gradient on the right, we can then understand why the machine has clustered them that way. So it turns out that cluster 4 in the middle is our very to moderate preterm. As we shift towards the right side of the dimension of the TSNE is the extreme preterm. And the purple cohort here is actually a subset of extreme preterm which are more ill, with higher HFOB and INO than the machine was able to discern. Now, how do we actually come up with these labels? I just wanted to share with a few tables to highlight how we look through the numbers and understand it. The main thing I want to share here is this is different from conventional statistics in the sense that statistical significance usually denotes something higher or lower in value. I just want to clarify that Gini and Shep does not work that way. Gini and Shep shows us which characteristic is important for every cluster, for each cluster. However, the importance can be it's because it's high, it's low, or because it's right in the middle. And the easiest way to visualize this is in terms of gestation and birth weight. Clusters 1, 2, 3, gestation and birth weight is important because these are the bigger babies. It is also important for extreme preterms, but because they are the smallest baby, it is also very important for cluster 4 because it's right in the middle. And that's how the Gini and Shep picks up these important characteristics to the machine. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about is we're going to talk about the late preterm to term group first from 1 to 3. So the cluster 1, we put it as a comparator, the low morbidity group. They have good UPGAR scores. They have the lowest proportion of birth resuscitation method needed, and they have the shortest length of stay. Now, cluster 2 and cluster 3 is the one that has some differences. UPGAR was ranked very importantly for all 3 clusters by virtue because cluster 1 is high, cluster 1 is good, cluster 3 as expected is very low, and cluster 2 is right on the middle, but these are not normal UPGAR scores. And it correlates towards more bagging and mass for cluster 2 and a lot more CPR cases for cluster 3 in terms of proportion. Understandably, just for the sake of showing the length of stay is definitely the longest for the extreme preterm group on cluster 6, which is the most ill. Now, I wanted to go through this a little bit more to show how the machine was trying to distinguish between cluster 2 and cluster 3. So the machine, without any biasness, was able to pick up cluster 3 had the highest, most significant amount of hours of cooling therapy. And this was supported with similarity with admission temperatures being the lowest, with more rates of seizures, and these are usually babies with moderate to severe encephalopathy. And this is keeping into what we expect as clinicians, because we expect this cluster. These are the term babies born in very adverse state, and they end up with therapeutic hypothermia. But the interesting thing is to see the machine trying to find another group of babies between the very well ones and these very sick ones coming in. And they found a group with very low HIE rates, very normal looking admission temperatures, and essentially definitely doesn't have very low cooling therapy. And the significance I will mention later on. If we were to look at the preterm cohort, the cluster 4 being very to moderate preterm, they are in the middle of everything as expected. For the extreme preterm cluster 5, the most important respiratory variable that discriminates them, it's the hours of duration of CPAP, which is expected because they spend a lot of time on it. For the more sick babies, and this is the part we can see the machine trying to tease out a separate group of extreme preterms, and these are the babies which, looking at the data, we can infer that these are more ill babies. They have higher support requirements like HFOB usage, longer hours of inhaled nitric oxide, more TPN usage, and more blood transfusion, as well as higher incidences of severe intraventricular hemorrhage or PVL. The numbers are very small, but this is a very crucial morbidity that has very adverse long-term outcome, as we will see later on. Now, so we have understand how the phenotypes work. Here comes the kicker. How do they actually stack up against outcomes? It's important that I want to drive here is up until this point, the clustering was done without the knowledge of the outcomes. And all these variables we now analyze are using just conventional statistics on Poisson regression. So essentially, we have done the step of clustering without knowledge of outcome, and now we are comparing it. So if we are looking at death up to 5 years, doing Poisson regression using cluster 1 as the comparable, if we were to do it on a forest plot, every single cluster compared to cluster 1 is statistically significant worse than cluster 1, which is not out of the surprise. We know that the extreme preterms are going to do a lot worse, right? Because you're stacking them up against late preterm to term babies. we know that term babies with HIE don't do well as well. That's why they have a 4 to 5-fold mortality. Now, the one that gives us a lot of concern, there is this group of cluster 2, like I mentioned. They are late preterm with poor UPGAR, but they are not to the extent of this severity as HIE. They are actually about 2 times to 2.5 times more sick and more likely to die compared to cluster 1. And this one gives us a lot of concerns because this come across as a group where the length of stay is not too different from our comparator group. They are born a bit more, needing a bit more support, but they seem to get better. And yet their mortality rates are completely different. And we feel that this is the vulnerable group that we may potentially be missing out. If we're going to go through education, just a crash course on NAPLAN for the interest of timekeeping. It's essentially the Australian National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy. It contains 5 specific domains: reading, writing, numeracy, grammar, and spelling. And we look at them in the primary school equivalents. Year 3 is equivalent to our standard 3 at about 8 to 9 years old. Year 5 about our standard 5 to standard 6, 10 to 11 years old. And NAPLAN is designed to identify children not meeting national minimum standards, which means needs further support. Firstly, we're going to look at overall achievement of NMS. Now, I wanted to mention this is still a work in progress, so the data curation is still ongoing. You will see that the number of test takers for both year 3, year 5 is less than the number of patients in each cluster. And we are still doing the codings for denominators, means that data unavailability due to ineligibility, like deaths or patient age and not being ready for exam yet. But we still have enough numbers to make a bit of an inference, and hence we're going to share it. If we were going to put it on the forest plot for both year 5 and overall picture for achieving NMS, we can see that, again, cluster 6 is expected to have the worst outcomes. So they have 2 times more failure to achieve NMS than cluster 1. It is also interesting to note that cluster 4, our very moderate to preterm babies, they are not statistically significant to cluster 1. Meaning to say that this group may actually have comparable outcomes to our controlled cluster of late preterm and term babies. The HIE cluster, we take it with a pinch of salt. The N value is really small and the range is really wide, which we think the denominator is going to show a lot of death. That's why they don't have that many test takers. If we look at specific domains, the only interest I wanted to show, this got nothing to do with the clustering or what we are trying to study, but we sort of interestingly found that in year 3, of all domains, numeracy was the lowest for NICU admissions, compared to the national average, whereby spelling scores is the lowest. So we might have to actually report that to the NSW government after this. But the summary is, if we want to look through specific domains failing to achieve national minimum standards, the summary that we can draw up is, when it comes towards education, cluster 4, whether it's it overall scores or specific domains, they are actually not too bad. They're actually comparable to the more stable, low morbidity NICU admissions, which are late preterm to term. There's variation, like for instance, cluster 5 between year 3 and 5, whereby the grammar, reading, and writing was initially okay for year 3, was comparable to cluster 1, but worsened by year 5. As expected, the more ill extreme preterm group, pretty much nearly every domain is worse. So in summary, our key findings thus far is using unsupervised machine learning approach with clustering to phenotype NICU admission with this large-scale multi-dimensional dataset, it is feasible, and that different phenotypes do have different meaningful outcomes despite our unbiased approach when it comes towards inserting characteristic. We pretty much just curated all the characteristic and let the machine do the clustering. What we're going to do next is, as you can see, there's some islands of mixtures within the TSNE plot, whether it's up here in the maroon island, there's a bit of orange dots. You can see these islands with green, red, and orange dot mixed in between. So we're trying to understand why this pockets of island have this sort of mixture of dots in it. We're also going to curate the outcomes. So the cerebral parsley dataset curation is still ongoing. And lastly, we were trying to see whether we can come up with an online model that can potentially help clinicians and families to do machine learning-based phenotype identification upon discharge. We feel that the utility of this study is that it allows us to detect previously unknown vulnerable groups, and it helps direct further research where we can switch it over to a targeted supervised machine learning later on. And it allows the reproducibility of the model in different datasets, meaning to say we can just pass the codes if you have a dataset to use it on your list of characteristics. However, the limitation, as we mentioned, this is a static snapshot of data points prior to NICU discharge. It's of course dependent on data availability and granularity, and we still need some element of clinical inference. There is no mathematical validation techniques that we're aware of at this moment. And while the technique is reproducible, it will be near impossible to get the same clusters because every data set will have differences in how the characteristics are available or how granular the data is. With that, I will end my presentation. However, I just want to cap it off by promoting a few events that we're going to be having. So the pediatrics department, along with the JPAP, we're going to be hosting World Patient Safety Day. It's going to be on 22nd to 23rd September, Monday and Tuesday. As this year in WHO, the theme is Safe Care for Every Newborn and Every Child. And the slogan is Patient Safety from the Start. We have multiple activities planned out, with the main day on Monday being in auditorium clinical for our lecture series. And for both days, there will be booths, posters, media's competition for posters and videos as well. And this is our tentative. So please feel free to join us. We also wanted to mention, in conjunction with World Patient Safety Day, it is also important to note about the environment. So Green at UMHealth, on the concurrent same days of 22nd and 23rd September, they are also running a waste management workshop. And this is crucial because we know that improving waste management, improving our climate and environment ultimately means better safety for children, both in our hospital as well as in our community. And they have a wonderful lineup of sessions as well. So for this workshop, the slots are a lot more limited. If I'm not mistaken, it's limited to 40 participants. So if you're interested in this for patient safety, please feel free to contact the organizers for that event as well. So with that, thank you very much for your kind time.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Chan. Okay, so I'm opening the floor to questions. I don't see any questions on the web so far. Yeah, so
there are a couple of questions, Prof.
I cannot see the questions. Where are the questions?
Do you want me to read it out for you?
Yeah, I mean, where are they? I don't see the questions.
It's in the Q&A button at the bottom.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, I'm not seeing the Q&A questions.
Would you like me to read it out for you?
Yeah, thank you so much.
So from Kun Chan say that did the database contain the emergency cesarean group category their mom was in when they were delivered?
I think I'll just do it from
from my computer. Sorry. Okay. So just a bit. Okay. So who's asking the question?
I'm not sure.
Sorry. Can we repeat the question? Sorry, we're just fixing our volume here. Yep.
Okay. From Kun Chan said that did the database contain the emergency cesarean group category their mom was in when they were delivered?
Yes, so we do have delivery types. We also have indication of cesarean section. So our delivery types for the perinatal data set, so it's a categorical variable. So it consists of vacuum, forceps, vertex delivery, as well as cesarean section. For the indication for cesarean section, however, it's a bit more limited. So it's just whether it's due to fetal distress, it's maternal indication. So that's why there's differences of granularity from what was recorded from all the data set. Yeah.
Okay. The next question would be how from Michelle, how would this data set or this new concept of machine learning affect the current NICU practice?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Now, so this is essentially more of a phenotyping exercise that we are doing, and we are probably the novelties we're trying to associate it with outcome. I'm going to answer this question very cautiously and say that for now, this model does not have any strength or capacity to say that it can potentially predict outcomes because this is a completely different technique, as I've mentioned on. However, what we feel is that it will potentially set the stepping stone for very specified supervised machine learning approach. So for instance, like cluster 2, we were able to detect this through our phenotyping exercise. In order to come up with a mathematical model that can predict outcomes for that group in its proper mathematical form, we will need to design a targeted supervised machine learning around that. So we believe this sets up further targeted research for us to then pursue our groups of interest. And that is the one that potentially may change NICU practice later on.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Chan, who has explained to us thoroughly. I'm just going to ask as a chair, I'm just going to ask just one question to Dr. Chan. How do you think you can use the same methodology for our National Neonatal Registry, do you think? Do you think we can use the same kind of methodology for our neonatal registry?
Yeah, I would need to answer this cautiously as well, because she's also my supervising consultant sitting right beside me. But jokes aside, when I first picked up this project, I did made it a point to see whether it's something potentially reproducible in Malaysia. Now, looking at the fundamentals of it, the most important thing is actually not the machine learning. It's actually the fact that they link the data set so well together. And I think there's an element that's potentially replicable when it comes to this, because we're talking all about patient identifier. You just need the same identifier from birth for the rest of their lives. And that just got me thinking, maybe this is still rather naive for me at this moment, because we have a wonderful thing known as our identification card number, right? We have our IC number, it's tied to our birth cert number. So if you're talking about linked data set, I think it's entirely possible to just use the same number. We may not have that much granularity, but for instance, if you can just link it to registry of death, for instance, which is a police-regulated government recording, right? So we can already study death based on that, based on what the birth cert number is and that. The other way to look at it, it's if you want to look at long-term developmental outcomes, schooling outcomes may be potentially easier to look at if we link their data set to the education ministry. So that's what I foresee that's possible. Coming down to Prof's specific question, because we do have a Malaysian neonatal registry that collects NICU for all government admissions. Two issues exist. One is it does not cover private admissions. The second thing is very important, because all what we are doing is essentially large-scale data usage. It's very important to ensure that the data accuracy is there, because this is one of the things whereby there's no other way to validate it. Meaning to say, if the data is off, the recording is challenging, then essentially the machine learning will be working on the premise of wrong data values to begin with. So we have to be very cautious with that.
Okay. I think thank you very much, Dr. Chan, for the very interesting presentation. So I think we will hand it over to Prof. Jeannie Wong, who actually thank you so much for helping with the technical issue earlier. Okay, and over to you, Prof. Jeannie Wong and Dr. Muhammad Shah. Thank you so much.
Okay.